What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of Not Your Average Meta's generous patrons, Martin Stanley, for everything he's done to help out the channel. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we have another fun game we filmed down at the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. This week's matchup features Martin playing his Boros deck being led by General Ferrous Rokiric, Patrick back playing Toxrill the Corrosive, Fallgirl playing another one of his Commander 19 decks, Rayami First of the Fallen, and Foil back playing his favorite Rakdos comedian, Blim Comedic Genius. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Fog plays a Thornwood Falls gaining a life, while Foil plays a Swamp and Martin plays a Mountain. Patrick plays a Swamp and then shows us up by playing a turn 1 Soul before casting a Foretell card. Fog plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 for an Evolutionary Leap. Foil plays a Mountain for turn and then passes to Martin, who plays the Plains and then casts a Swiftblade Vindicator. Patrick plays an Island for turn and then pays 2 to cast a Demonic Tutor in order to go get a card from his library while he passes his turn to Fog, who plays a Forest for turn. Fog pays 1 and casts an Uktabi Drake before he then goes to combat, gaining First Blood by hitting Martin for 2 damage. Foil plays another Swamp and then once again passes his turn. Martin draws and then goes to combat, swinging the Vindicator over at Fog for 2 damage before he then passes his turn to Patrick. Patrick draws for turn and then casts a Rhystic Study before he then passes to Fog, who untaps and then pays the Uktabi Drake's Echo cost. Fog draws and then plays an Island for turn before he then goes to combat, swinging the Drake over Patrick this time for 2 damage. Foil plays a Mount for turn and then finally has enough to cast his commander, Blim Comedic Genius. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Justice Strike in order to send Blim back to the command zone before he then adds Insult to Injury by swinging his Swiftblade Vindicator over Foil for 2 damage. Patrick plays a Swamp for turn and then casts his Soul Shatter, which has Fog and Martin both sacking each of their creatures. Fog plays a Force for turn and then pays to cast a Malacator's Watcher. Foil just plays a Swamp and passes. Martin draws and then casts a Durgar Assailant, as well as a Boros Recruiter, having Patrick draw 2 cards. Patrick plays an Island and then casts a Clackbridge Troll, which has him giving 3 0/1 goats to Foil. He then goes to combat and no one sacks a creature, so he swings the Troll over Martin for 8 damage. Fog plays a Force for turn before he then casts a Farseek in order to go get that tapped Swamp from his library that he's been looking for. He then goes to combat and swings the Watcher over Patrick for 1 damage and passes. Foil plays a Mountain for turn before paying to cast the last one standing. He then rolls the dice, which has one of Martin's creatures surviving while the rest of them get destroyed. But in response to this, Fog pays to sack his Watcher to his Evolutionary Leap, which has him drawing a card before he then reveals cards from the top of his library until he hits a creature. He then bottoms the rest of the cards while Martin draws for turn and then goes to combat, swinging his creature over at Fog. Martin then casts a Goblin Legionnaire and passes his turn over to Patrick, who draws before he taps out in order to cast his commander, Toxrill. On his end step, each creature gets a -1/-1 slime counter while Fog plays a Forest for turn. Fog then pays to cast his commander Rayami before he then pays an additional 3 to cast a Jewel Thief, creating a treasure token when it enters play. On his end step, more slime counters get put onto creatures, which sends some of them into exile while Foil starts his turn. Foil then plays a Blight Step Pathway for turn before paying enough to cast a Blasphemous Act. This then has Fog paying to sack his creature to the Evolutionary Leap until he reveals a creature from the top of his library. He then puts a creature into his hand and the rest of the creatures get destroyed. Martin draws and then passes his turn to Patrick, who plays another Swamp for turn. Patrick then pays 6 and casts a Shark Typhoon. Fog plays an Island for turn and then pays enough to recast his commander a second time. Patrick then draws a card, and Fog uses his treasure to help him cast a Tomebound Lich. This then has him drawing a card and discarding a card when he enters play. Foil plays another Mountain for turn before paying to recast his commander a second time. Martin draws and then finally hits the 3rd land. He then taps out and finally casts his commander, General Ferrous Rokiric, which has Patrick drawing a card. Patrick draws for turn and then casts a Sludge Monster, which has him putting a slime counter on Fog's commander. On his end step, Fog pays to sack his commander to the Evolutionary Leap, revealing a creature off the top of his library. Fog plays a command tower for turn before he then pays to cast his commander a 3rd time. Fog then casts a Bloodhound before he then pays to sack his Tomebound Lich to the Evolutionary Leap, revealing a creature from the top of his library. Foil plays a Swamp for turn, then pays 4 to cast a Nefarious Lich. He then also casts a Treacherous Blessing, which has him drawing 3 cards when it enters play. Foil then goes to combat, hitting Patrick with his commander, which has him donating the Nefarious Lich to him. Patrick then loses an additional life from controlling one of Foil's permanents and he discards a card. Martin draws and then casts Tajik Legion's Edge, which has him create a Golem token when it enters play. Martin then goes to combat and swings his commander over at Foil, who just takes the damage. Patrick plays an Underground River for turn before he then pays to cast his commander a second time. On his end step, the creatures then get more slime counters and some get sent into exile. Fog draws for turn and then tries to target the sludge monster with a Beast Within. In response, Patrick then activates his trap card, revealing a Depart the Realm, bouncing the sludge monster back to his hand. He then creates a Flying Shark token while Fog casts a Venom Thrup. Fog then casts a Deadly Dispute, sacking the Venom Thrup, which has him drawing 2 cards and creating another treasure token. Fog then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Patrick, who blocks with his Flying Shark, but Fog still gains 4 life. On his end step, more creatures then get slime counters and get put into exile while Foil draws for turn. Foil then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Martin, who takes the damage and has Foil targeting his Treacherous Blessing in order to put it into his graveyard. Patrick then once again loses a life and discards a card by owning one of Foil's permanents. Finally, Foil casts a Soul Ring and then goes to his end step, putting more slime counters on each of the creatures. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Rim Carlos. Martin then goes to combat, swinging Rim Carlos over at Patrick and his Golem over at Foil, who just takes the damage, while Patrick has to exile cards from his graveyard. On his end step, more creatures die to the slime counters, while Fog chooses to sacrifice his commander to his enchantment in order to reveal a creature from the top of his library. Patrick draws for turn and then tries to recast a sludge monster, which has Foil responding with the Tybalt's Trickery. In response to this, Patrick counters it with a good old counterspell and the sludge monster resolves. Patrick then puts another slime counter on Martin's creature, which has him dying and has him creating a slug token. Patrick then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Fog for 6 commander damage. Fog plays a Swamp for turn and then casts a Tide Hollow Strix before passing. Foil draws and then plays a Temple of Malice, which has him scrying 1 card, keeping it on top of his library. He then casts a Rust Elemental and goes to his end step, which has Fog once again sacking his creature's enchantment until he once again reveals a creature card. Martin draws for turn and reveals a land off the top of his library. He then casts the Intervention part of his split card targeting Patrick, which has him responding by casting a Syncopate, countering the spell. He then creates another Flying Shark token and untaps for turn, drawing. Patrick then plays a Swamp for turn before once again swinging his commander over at Fog, while he also swings 2 of his creatures over at Foil and 2 of his creatures over at Martin. Fog responds by flashing in a Winged Coatl in order to block Patrick's commander. His commander then gets into the command zone and everyone else just takes their damage. Patrick then pays to recast his commander a 3rd time before passing his turn to Fog. Fog plays a Force for turn before also recasting his commander a 4th time. He then swings his commander over at Patrick before casting Tyvar Stand, which has him pumping him up enough to exile all the cards from his graveyard, taking him out of the game. Foil then gets his enchantment back before starting his turn, which has him drawing and playing a Swamp. He then pays to recast his commander and passes his turn to Martin, while Fog remembers to gain his life, and Martin draws for turn before paying 3 for a Sky Knight Legionnaire. Martin then goes to combat, swinging the Legionnaire over at Foil, who blocks with his commander, and in response, Martin casts Make Your Mark, targeting his creature, and in response to that, Foil casts a Sudden Spoiling, which has Martin's creature becoming a 0/2 with no abilities. Martin's creature then dies and Fog starts his turn by untapping and drawing. He then plays a Swamp for turn before playing Ronas the Indomitable and paying to sack it to the Evolutionary Leap. He then reveals a creature off the top of his library, putting it to hand, before he then attacks Foil with his commander, which has Foil exiling 5 cards from his graveyard. Fog then gains 5 life and pays to cast a Gurmag Swiftwing, a Drakewing Krasis, and a Glissa Sunslayer. Foil draws for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn before going to combat, swinging his commander over at Martin. Martin can't block, so he takes the damage and Foil donates him the Nefarious Lich. Foil then casts a Crown of Doom before he then pays 2 in order to gift the Crown of Doom over to Fog. Martin returns and sits back down at the table before he untaps for turn and draws. He then pays to cast a Sunrise Cavalier, making it day before passing his turn to Fog. Fog draws for turn and goes straight to combat, swinging his entire team over at Martin, which is enough damage to exile his graveyard, taking him out of the game. Fog then gains 5 more life before he pays to sack one of his creatures to his enchantment, revealing a creature from the top of his library, before then paying to do it a second time, revealing another creature off the top of his library. He then pays to cast an emergency weld, returning his Malakar Watcher back to his hand and creating himself a 1/1 colorless soldier token. He then once again sacks the Malacator's Watcher to his enchantment, which has him drawing a card before he then reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals another creature card. He then passes his turn to Foil, who draws for turn and then casts an Immortal Coil. He then activates the coil in order to exile 2 cards from his graveyard, which has him going out on his own terms and losing the game to Fog. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.